Thanks for coming. It's good to be here again. We want to share with you some of our thoughts around the process of children's books, and I use the word process quite specifically, and I'll come to that later. So what we'll do is Susie will go through a number of children's books, some examples that she's been analysing as part of a broader research project into children's identity and how they create it. So the background to this particular project is that my research team at the university focuses on how people create their sense of identity, who they are, in relation to their work. So we take the view that the way you talk about yourself, the way you write about yourself, is what creates your identity. And we're particularly keen on seeing how adults do that, in the way that adults talk and write about themselves. But recently Susie brought to us the concept of having a look at children's books. Now, you know, children's books have been around for a long, long time. There's nothing unusual about that fact. But what's interesting about this particular project is that we can see that kids' concerns now possibly become their careers later in life. And there's a nice quote that I'll give. It's a very good colleague, Mark Savickas, uses the expression, children's preoccupations become their occupations. In other words, their preoccupations, their concerns, their challenges, the struggles that they're going through, their preoccupations later in life become their occupations. So what you overcome becomes yourself. So more of that later. The broader scene around this idea that writing about, talking about, speaking about oneself in career goes to this particular theory that we like to use called the theory of dialogical self. Now it's an unusual theory. I'll talk more about it after Susie's given some background to it. But what's happening with dialogical self theory, particularly in Europe, is that scholars and authors and therapists and teachers are grasping the ideas of this theory to change the way people overcome problems in life, but also to teach university students how to write about themselves. So I'll give you a good example of that later. So for now, that's enough of an introduction. So I'll ask Susie to talk about her books that she's analysing, and then we'll go on from there. So over to you.
Thank you. Just for those who weren't here earlier, so a friend of mine, Emma McTaggart, who's running today, runs a child rights program. Part of that program is that children get to write, illustrate and have their book published, which is exciting. It targets probably kids around the age of 10. So this is the outcome. They produce this little book, and essentially she goes in and she tells them to write a story. So that story is about anything they want to write about. So that's what we're interested in. So I said to Emma, I'd really like to look at all of these children's stories because I think there's something in these stories. And so we started getting the books. They were being delivered. There's 300 of them. And I started reading them and just trying to get an idea of, in terms of what Peter was talking about, you know, how could we look at these books and see that there's just beyond the story. So that's sort of where the background of where we were headed. So just to give you an idea of one of the stories, will I read it? Yep. Can you just hold? I might read a story, because there's so few of you, it'd be really nice just to read a little story. Can you just take? So this is it. This is Lachlan Loves to Fly, or Lachlan Loves Flying, by a little boy, Lachlan Hammond. It's a beautiful story. He's 10 years old and he's a little boy who loves planes. So the story goes on that his family give him planes and anything to do with flying for Christmas, for his birthday. And then one year he gets given from his family a ticket for a flight. And he's got to go on this joy flight. And he's thinking about the ticket and this flight, and he starts to get really anxious. And so in the book he actually starts to describe this. He says, I get to it. Was thinking, Lachlan got goosebumps on his arms and his hands were sweaty. His face went really white and he thought he was going to be sick. So it continues on. Dad, there is something I need to tell you. I'm so scared of heights. Lachlan was terrified. So when I started looking at the books to begin with, I thought, there's this theory around interests, and if we look at interests, we can then get a bit of an idea of perhaps what they might be interested in down the track. So if you were to look at this book to start with, you might think, well, this little boy loves planes, loves being outdoors, loves adventure. But when you started thinking about those things that I just shared with you, about those problems that he had, I think that's when you start to realise that there's actually more to the books. Do you want me to have a break? Yep.
Well, Susie's raised this idea of interests. And what we know about career interests in particular is one of the grand theories which has been well and truly tested over the last 50 years, is of all the career interests that people can have, there's about 6 clusters. And they're realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising and conventional. And for short, that acronym we say the RIASEC model. So the realistic ones are what it sounds like. These are the jobs where people want to do things that are hands-on, practical. They can see things, they can do things. The investigative interests tend to be those things where people have a curious interest in the way the world works. Usually people end up doing scientific type careers. Artistic, much more creative. And the social, as it sounds like, social actually being with people, so people-oriented. Enterprising tends to be people who are much more interested about not just enterprising in the sense of entrepreneurship, but enterprising in the sense of social dynamics and getting, like politics, things like that. And conventional, these are the careers which involve a lot of regulations, a lot of rules. You just follow the yellow brick road and you'll eventually get there. So this theory, as I said, is about 50 years old, and we've got mountains of evidence that it works in terms of being able to classify particular work environments and classify people's interests in those work environments. It's a two-way street. What we don't know is how people develop those interests. There are some people who like to think that everything's genetic and you're born with it. Well, sorry, that's not the case. When it comes to personality, characterological features in one's personality, you could get away with saying about roughly 30% is due to your physical makeup, your character as it's called. But we all grow up, we all have different experiences, and eventually, through the great hurly-burly of life, you end up doing what you're doing. So it's not just genetics or biology, it's something else. So how do we now look at ourselves as adults and go, well, I can identify my career interests as I or AS or whatever in terms of the RIASEC. How did we get there? That's the interesting question. So Susie's trying to come at that from the point of view of children's stories.
So when we started, So when we started, we were just looking at the stories themselves, and what came to us or came to me was that actually these little stories are personal stories. So they're actually sharing their experiences. So this little boy really loves to fly. And then we were looking at it's actually really interesting because when you delve into it, which is why I shared that little bit, is that you're looking at, they're actually identifying a problem. And it's in the solving of that problem that you can really get an idea of these kids and these authors and their personality traits and how they're solving those problems gives us an indication of potential career aspirations. So this little boy he loves to fly, but he's really scared. In dealing with his anxiety, he asks his father for help. So he's communicating that this is what I need to do, I need some help. His father says, I actually know what I can do, I can help you, I can solve this. So his father gives him some strategies of how to overcome his fear of heights. And in the end, he does the joy flight, and it's great. So it's those processes of asking for help, using communication skills, recognising that he has a problem. Really it is that helping trait, that little personality characteristic, which gives us a little potential for actually this child is social, he wants to be a helper. So we can say, well, in terms of that Holland theory, this child, through writing this story and telling this narrative, actually he might be someone who could go down that path of social, something in that career.
There's a little bit of ancient history to the psychology of all of this, because you've probably all heard of Sigmund Freud, and Freud was a genius for his time. Nowadays people don't quite understand Freud in contemporary context, but in the day, in Victorian Europe, he was a genius in terms of working out theories in which people's anxieties and fears were like fluids and liquids. It was a hydraulic model where things were under pressure and they eventually burst out. One of his disciples was Alfred Adler, and Adler was the founder of what became known as self-psychology. And Adler had this disagreement with Freud and said, look, really, I don't think it's all about internal pressures and people breaking out and busting out all over the place. What Adler's point was that children's struggles set them for a lifetime. It sets them for a trajectory of who they're going to be growing into. He then moved across the United States and set up a child therapy clinic, and the rest is history from there. But what he gave to the intellectual world, the therapeutic world, and the world of authors is this idea that if you challenge and overcome, that will set you in a particular direction. Not sort of like in concrete. So the practical task for us becomes, as writers and authors and editors and counsellors and teachers, is how do we create situations in which children who are storying and creating a story of their life, for their life, how do we create an environment which facilitates that authorial process of them taking some power over their future direction? What are your thoughts?
Well, the beauty of the books is that it's actually a pure process. So they're coming in and they're writing off the cuff about something. So just whatever they might think of. So they're using that beautiful story, but within that story, they're actually providing an expression of that dialogical processes that Peter started to talk about. So those conversations that are going in their heads, they're actually putting it into paper and actually writing that process down, which is really unusual because it wasn't what I was expecting when I read the books, because you don't expect children at 10 to be able to write like that. But as we know, and the research now tells us, children are really aware of how to problem solve, how to think. They have an acute awareness of where they are in the world and perhaps where they want to go, more than what we probably give them credit for. And I think in terms of that Adlerian theory and working, with that process, it's quite interesting. I mean, from the time children are born, they're surrounded by the world of work. So they're exposed to it and they're going to see it at home, and they're going to role play it, they're going to think about it. So they're really exposed to it. So when it comes to writing stories, which is a really fascinating way of looking at the theory and using this almost as a tool for early career aspirations, it's actually quite exciting what the children are prepared to put down.
Well, part of that process is what Susie mentioned, is conversation. And this is where the theory of dialogical self comes in, right? I'll give you a phenomenological example of what I'm talking about. And as I'm talking right now, there are at least one voice in your head talking. At least one, right? Now, we all do it. We all have the voices in our heads, right? And that's not meant in terms of being the experience people have in a psychotic episode. Hearing voices inside your head, in your mind, is a natural human phenomenon. We've all had that situation where we might have an argument with someone, right? And then you say something, and then 5 minutes later you're driving in your car and you're going, oh, I should have said this. And you're replaying it in your mind. And what you notice when you're replaying it in your mind is that it's not just one monotonous voice like this one talking right now. Your mind has the capacity to give each voice its own sound, its own texture, and make it like the other person's voice, right? We can all do this. Some better than others. And what Hubert Herman's did with his theory of dialogical self is took that very natural human process and went, right, so we do talk to ourselves inside our heads, and we do talk to other people, literally. So he says that sense of who we are is created by conversations with self, with others, real and imagined. So we do it with real fleshy people and then the imagined versions of you. And as I say, you're doing it right now. You're talking in your head, listening to me and also listening to yourself. How do we capture that process? Because it's a natural, normal process. What can we do with that in terms of writing? That's the interesting challenge. So, do kids do it? Do kids have that dialogue going on inside their head? Yes, they do. It might not be the same as the content of what adults do, but the mental process is there. Children can imagine voices.
It is really interesting because of all the books that I have read, probably, so it's 300, I would say only 10, which is a really small minority, are not writing about those voices in their head. So 10 have given beautiful stories about description, like some of them are gorgeous, they're incredibly descriptive, but the rest of the books have actually identified a problem. I think it's that identification of the problem, which is the little voice in your head saying, or my head saying, oh, actually this person is writing about this conversation. And because the children are doing it blindly in a way without thinking about it, it's actually a really lovely thing because it's just so pure, and so they're prepared to be quite expressive at times about that process. Actually, Jen, you're in the order. Am I allowed to talk about your daughter's book? So it's a beautiful book. So Jen's daughter wrote a book, which can I show? Is that, yep, perfect. Annie. Yeah, I've got the pile. Thank you. Just for Sophie. So this is a gorgeous book, Just for Sophie. So it's a beautiful little story, very sweet, but it's clearly, you can tell because the whole thing about the story is that she actually wants a friend. So she's going on holidays, she knows mum and dad are really busy like all of us with kids, and she's thinking in her head, oh, what can I do? I know, I'm going to get a pet. And it's her process of getting this pet to actually keep her company so she's no longer lonely. And it's that little process of identifying the problem and then engaging in problem-solving techniques, which is that narrative and writing down of those conversations, which is beautiful really because they're doing it without thinking or without a career counsellor telling them or a psychologist. It worked in the end. The story's really beautiful. She gets a pet and is very happy. Yeah, so it's that process. I think it does. They do. So from that age of 10, I think children are able to identify the little voices and the conversations, and they are clearly able to write about them. It mightn't be perfect, but it's getting there.
So the evidence that we have of seeing the multiple voices is in the way a story is written. Now, your basic story is just one voice narrating something, blah, 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 and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. That's your traditional sort of narrated, event-based story. But what Dostoevsky invented for us in humanity is the polyphonic novel. It's the novel with multiple voices in it. And we take it for granted now because we all grew up with it, because there'd be one voice talking on a particular page, blah, 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 and then another voice comes out of the page. Me, 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 right? Totally different person, totally different place, space, completely different. But who endows the voices on that page? Close, the reader. The writer structures it so that you do that, right? Of course, Dostoevsky had his own voices as he's coming out, but as you're reading it, you create those voices, and each one gets their own particular emotional characteristics, their own sounds, their own rhythms about who they are. So you bring those voices to life in the narrative. So let's just flip it over and pretend our kids in these books are the Dostoevskys. So how do we know that they're flip-flopping and creating different voices in their stories? We can see it because they go blah, 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 and then there's a response coming from another voice. So...
Yep. Oh. One of the stories is gorgeous because he actually clearly identifies it. So a little boy who is really nervous sitting in the classroom, he actually describes the classroom as being like a dungeon. So when he's sitting in the dungeon, he gets itchy skin and he's wanting to throw up and it's making him feel really sick. So the voices in his head are saying, how can I get better? How can I do this? Because he wants to do really well in school. The flip side of it is actually he loves to run and he wants to be an Olympian. But he finally works out, and he's writing it in the story as he progresses. If I go for a run, and he says, he Googles it, so he actually writes in the story, I Google this. It gets my endorphins running and it actually makes me feel better and I feel happier. So he did a little experiment. So he went for this big run at a cross country, came back, sat down, lo and behold, my math was better. I actually felt happier in the classroom. He continues a little story on, and with each little bit, it is that process of just journaling and writing down those stories and the conversations that's coming out through that process in the end.
And part of conversations that make things meaningful is what counts, right? You can have like a two-way chit-chat, like this. Hello, hello. Right? That's not really meaningful. What Hermans and another personality theorist has shown us in research is that to get meaning from a conversation, there has to be 3 steps. 3 steps. And the way, one of those funny little experiments that was done by Hermans was there's a painting on a wall. And people had to look at the painting and say something to the painting out loud. Say something. And then imagine what she, the subject of the painting, said back to them. And then respond back to what the imagined came from the painting. So say, imagine, say back. 1, 2, 3. So when we think about how people make their stories meaningful in conversation and in stories, what we're looking for is going beyond the simple flip-flop. It's got to be another flip. So that continual iterative process of going back and forward. And that's what Susie's seeing in these books, is that constant movement across what Hermans refers to as the I position. So I'll get to that in a second. You go, so I can see one.
No, it's all good. I'm sharing the stories because I really want people to feel and understand how exciting it is. The little book that Peter's got there is a book written by a young man who says in the book, I want to be an aircraft, I want to fly Hornets. So it's an incredible story because he's actually describing in great detail how he's flying this Hornet. He sees enemy planes and he's got to shoot them down. And then he has to land the plane for the very first time on an aircraft carrier. And he's really nervous. So he actually starts to describe these feelings in terms of his anxiety, and he's worried that he's going to miss the end up in the sea, and that costs a lot of money. Now, this book's really fascinating because the child takes, or the author, I should be saying, the author takes an incredibly practical, task-oriented approach to it. So he's thinking really quite constructively about how he's going to do it with no emotion, which you could imagine that this child will probably end up without in that area. So this little boy would definitely fit within that Holland's process of being that realistic sort of person that would potentially go and do that sort of work.
So the question is, who's talking? Who's talking in that problem-solving situation? So there's a psychologist from 100 years ago at least, William James, came up with the idea of there's the I and the me. There's a single person, single ego, but there are variations. I am the owner of all of the various things I have. I own my jeans, I own my shoes, I, like that. I have an empirical me, there's a measurable me. What Herman's did was say, well, that's really good, but there's different I's. And Herman's called these I positions. Position's really important. I'll get to position soon. So I can have an I position of I, the father, I, the husband, I, the university lecturer. Right? Each of those I's have their own values, their own views, their own perspectives. They even have their own voices. Because when I, the father, talk sometimes to the children, it's not a pleasant character compared to what we're all meant to be like, right? So what we then do in the dialogical self theory is, how do the various I positions talk to one another? And positions important. Remember I said we've got to go A, B, C, like that. So you're talking with someone, and it's in space and time. So when you look at a novel, a polyphonic novel, the words are there, and then suddenly you can go from one paragraph at this point in time and somebody's talking, and in the next paragraph you might be in a different country. You're still on the same page, but you're spatially in a different place. That's how we operate as humans. We can jump around in psychological space, and that's what the dialogical self is on about. So I, the dad, can actually have a conversation with I, the academic. And they're completely different people. Right? Same body, different people. And that's one of the things we sort of get challenged by when we hear a lot of people say, oh, you must be a whole. You must bring your I into one whole. That isn't possible, because we are multiple I's within one skin. And we hear those multiple I's talking inside books. So do you hear multiple I's of your kids?
Very much so. It's very hard because I've got an 18-year-old, so I've got I the friend now too, which is an interesting concept, as well as I the mother, and then I the very strict mother who gives us some you must be home by this time. I think that the books, that dialogical process that Peter's describing is coming through the books in that very simple problem solving, and how they're answering themselves really in the book about how to resolve that issue. And that's all those lovely processes that are going on, and they're really writing them quite simply. Some are quite elegantly, but quite beautifully in the stories.
Do any of the books have a character that is an animal? And does the animal speak? Yes,
so a lot of them use all sorts of animals, from aliens to penguins. And it is interesting because when you are reading them as an adult, that's an I adult, and then you've got the child coming in. So it's quite a fascinating process, but it still comes out at the end because they're still using those same things to look at how they're presenting the conversations. Yeah.
So, as readers and I'll come to you, as readers and as theorists around this, we have to be asking ourselves, how is it that children have the capacity to create different voices of these characters represented in their book, knowing that the characters in their book are actually one of their own little I positions that they own? That's a fascinating question. Now, you have a question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm
hold on a second.
Probably don't need that anyway.
It's for the record.
What the hell?
For the record.
So are you saying it's this, supporting the child author is actually gifting a therapeutic process, really, because it creates self-awareness and even potentially for self-development? Yeah.
Sorry.
So-
It's a beautiful process because I spoke earlier, and when I was preparing for the talk, it actually occurred to me that, these books are actually brilliant, because part of it is a therapeutic process. And we heard a beautiful lady speak this morning about her personal story of writing a book. It's the same thing. I think what these kids are doing, in a sense, is, a lot of them have issues with bullying. So a lot of them will talk about being bullied in the classroom or being bullied in the schoolyard. And, they're so creative in how they're dealing with that, and they're actually writing it. So you're 100% correct. I think part of that problem solving is quite therapeutic. And the fact that they actually are able to resolve the problem is helpful, because we can then look at things, down the track in terms of early career aspirations, or saying, rightio, this person might need a bit of a hand with something. So the interesting thing is that there's always a really good outcome. So even though the problem might seem to be quite difficult, even the book about being lonely, so it sounds really sad. Some of them are quite heartbroken. So one of the stories, a young man writes about, he's really sad, he's really lonely, he has no friends. So he creates a balloon, and the balloon is his only friend. And at one point, he actually climbs into the balloon because he feels really safe. When he wakes up, he's in another city, and he runs into another friend, into another little boy who has a balloon as well. And this continues and continues. So they keep meeting people. So that's the conversations there already. So what happens in the end is the balloons join together, and the children, he writes beautifully, they let go of the balloons and they're happy. So it is very much a therapeutic tool, yeah. Which is actually quite delightful, because they're doing it themselves. So it's their own stories. They're authoring these stories themselves. They're not being told, this is what it's for. So it's a very pure way of looking at their own world and how they're creating their personal identity.
It's good that it comes back to hope too. So often that's something we want to like holding hope that things will work out. We need that, don't we?
Look, the kids are quite resourceful, but the books aren't all from private schools, they're from all over, which is fascinating too. So I'm not really interested per se, because you're just taking these books and you're looking at the stories and you're thinking, all right, where's the problem and what are they doing? So some of the children, probably from some of really interesting rural areas, actually have really great resources. They're so clever in, how, like a little girl wrote about, she was being bullied because she was really tall. And getting a really hard time. So she dealt with it by doing things. So she helped in the classroom when people needed something off a high. And they eventually, in the end, they loved her for what she was doing. So it has this lovely outcome. I think that's very clever what children do, that process of being able to put down the stories, of using those dialogues and the voices, it has that lovely outcome.
Hope is critical, and there's a feature in what makes hope that comes through the dialogical self and dialogue with self. It's perspective of the future. I mentioned this morning, so I'll repeat it again though, is that the difference between an optimist and someone who's not an optimist is that optimists can create more potential images, scenarios, possibilities of the future. So it's almost like they've got 20 different potential future directions they can take, right? How do we create situations where people can elaborate and create more of those potentials? Because the more potentials one has, the more hope you have, right? Whereas if you've got one storyline and it's that's not good. That's a recipe for falling in a hole. And what we know about people who get quite depressed is that they have this thing called the cognitive triad of depression: self, world and future. Negative thoughts about myself, negative thoughts about everything around me, negative thoughts about the future. I'm no good, everything I do is no good, and it's always going to be this way. And it's that last bit about how do I create scenarios for the future that helps people lift out of, oh, I'm no good, because it gives them options. So storying can do that. But to what extent should we do it directively? Because Susie said these stories come from people naturally, right? Do we set up situations, go, right, write a story about the future, make it a good one? I want at least 4 scenarios. What do we do? How do we use this natural process of creating futures without being overly editorial? That's a challenge. What are your thoughts? And I'll come to the audience for that.
From a personal level, I'd love to see that they just write, that they get this beautiful process and to write a story, because all kids have dreams. And I think that is the premise of looking at early career aspirations or using it as a therapeutic tool. They all have dreams. Kids all will have something about the future that they aspire to or aspire to be. The beauty of using a tool like Child Rights or using that approach is that they are just writing a story. In fact, I had a conversation with my husband because a friend of mine has a child who has severe Asperger's, and I said, oh, it'd be great for him to do this story. But comes with it those interesting things of parent expectation, or all sorts of things, so I think it is that finding that balance, because what we have at the moment is 300 beautiful books that are just written for the joy of writing, and we're able to use that information so cleverly to look at future things, where we could head them, helping in the classroom, giving kids hope that actually, you know what, you might be able to be that aircraft Hornet airplane person if you want to be, or a writer, or it's an interesting.
One of the pieces of research which is significant around this, if we sort of look backward in time, is when we talk to adults of very clear stereotypical occupations, police officer, fireman, those sorts of things. If you listen to their stories, you will find in their early past, in the early years, where they've overcome a problem, and that overcoming became the signature of their trajectory. So keep your eyes on your kids playing Batman or fireman or whatever. That may very well be a signal for what they're trying to overcome in terms of their own worries in the present time. And when they overcome it, they've got that sense of confidence and self-efficacy to do it again in life and beat those challenges again. And is that where their interests start to consolidate? Well, that's the research we have to answer. Now, we're getting to that point in the session where we have to start inviting more questions, so you've sort of got us going. So, over to you now for some questions and comments. Let's get this dialogical conversation happening.
I think the mic's going, okay. Sorry, I missed the intro to your presentation, but it's very interesting, very fascinating work. What I'm interested in, because there seems to be a lot of talk about like what kids are writing and what that predicts in terms of their work. Is this going? Oh, okay. Yeah, what that predicts in terms of their work. I'm sort of more interested in what that might predict in terms of certain vulnerabilities. Just, from my own perspective, I have bipolar disorder, or was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and what I've found interesting sort of in hindsight is that pretty much all of my friends, all of the people who are my closest friends, have all had major mental illness. And so I was just wondering if that sort of vulnerability comes out in the stories at all.
It is really interesting because I think it does. The vulnerabilities are coming out. It's quite extraordinary what you do pick up. I think there's a lot of some of the stories will talk about their anxieties. So I think and very clearly will write about how they're feeling, and you can get that little trigger going, oh, gee, actually this child probably could do with some help. So one of the girls, actually, I've got the story here, I actually cried when I read I had to read it a couple of times. it's this incredible, so she's clearly going to be some writer or something artistic. It's this incredible journey or journal, I will call it a journal, about how her mother died. I can make some assumptions how the mother died from what she mentions in the book, but she talks about the fatigue and the words that she's using, and you do feel as you're reading it, and partly that is because I'm a social worker, so I'm looking for those things because that's what we're trained to do. And perhaps if you were in the classroom, you could say, well, these are triggers, and you can see them in through the writings and the stories. She's obviously quite depressed and quite sad, and it's coming. Her expression is quite about the loss and wanting to fall off a cliff, and it's really quite. She's really writing it quite well. So I think you're right. I think the stories could be used, and you can pick up those triggers through it. And in some ways, even though you can look at it from that mental health sort of perspective, but they can also give you that thing, well, actually this is a child who obviously wants to help and be a helper as well. So I think it is that sort of drawing together the two, which is quite fascinating. Yeah, I mean, obviously if I was doing it in the classroom with a group of children and they had written that story, you would have to say, look, I have a few worries about, and you could do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Just with that point of reading out aloud stories in a classroom, that happened to me when I was in high school, and I'd written a story which was a really personal story, and it was quite cathartic in a way, but I was devastated for it to be read in front of the class because I wasn't asked if it could be read. It was just read, and then it was almost like my secret self is revealed.
Yeah.
So, I think that, English teachers actually in the classroom have an immense responsibility in terms of those little people. So,
one of the points you make is extremely important because what we know from the research about people writing stories, telling stories, hearing stories, is the physical process of hearing your own words read aloud, like in your own story read by yourself, then you hearing your voice in your ears, right? That's very moving for some people in the process that I do with some of my postgraduate students and an activity that I use to help them write about who they are. But the really transformative thing is to hear someone else read your words, and then you hear your words in someone else's voice in your own ears. It's that spatialisation. And as much as that's a challenging one, it can also be sort of used as an example of, well, how can we make the most of this really transformative moment where people can hear their own story aloud rather than whispered it.
Yeah.
It's true, but then not only was that story... Not only was that story read in class, it was published again in the school magazine, again without my consent. Oh. And then it was something that, was really deeply personal about an event that had happened in my life. And, my mother rang me, I was at university, you've got to come home, I need to talk to you. And it was devastating for her too, because it was this whole, but anyway, it was sort of cathartic, but the process was quite brutal in a way.
Badly handled, though.
Yeah, very bad.
Well, it was, the 80s,
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah, please.
I'm a teacher. What I do poetry for well-being with my students when the opportunity presents. And so when I did a couple of years ago a project with grade 5s and 6s, we're talking about cyberbullying, and what we did, I said to the kids, firstly it was non-compulsory, secondly it was non-assessed, and thirdly, please use a pseudonym. And that way you only share with who you want to share with. So if it is read aloud in that context, they can have the secret joy that their words are being listened to without their identity being betrayed. And I do that in my workshops all the time. People really appreciate it. And often they'll go, no, I'm happy to share. But you give them that choice. Yeah. The question I was going to ask is, of the 300 that you received, were any of them were they all written as prose, or were some of them written as poetry in verse?
Some of them were written as poetry in verse, which is really interesting. So the little girl who did the grief was poetry in verse. So it is. So I'm not coming from looking at I'm not assessing their language or but some of it is quite beautiful how they're writing. A little boy wrote about a fire, so he's obviously experienced the fire, and it is in poetry. But within the poetry, he's still problem solving, so he's still talking about how to manage things. So it is quite beautiful to get that, and you think, oh, this is actually really. And they're all 10, yeah, it is interesting. You were talking about your story. I had a story with my daughter who'd been to the Museum of Modern Art in Tasmania, or the Museum of New and Old Art, and she came back and shared a story. So she was obsessed with it. We spent 3 days there. She loved it. It is quite dark for those of you who haven't been there. And she came back and she wrote a story to her Year 7 teacher about being stuck in a room and having to claw her way out. There was actually a room there that was very dark, and we had to walk out of it. But it is interesting because it did turn out that she was quite anxious, and we did move schools following that. And I think the story was an incredible way of sharing her, what was actually happening for her. Unfortunately, it was dealt very well, and we were able to move her quickly. But it is interesting what can happen in the classroom.
So, when we think about it in terms of time perspective, we've got story and storying for making sense of the past, perhaps transforming memories, experiences, understandings of the past, and then story and storying for the future. So what is your experience around working with the past and the future? What sort of things that you do in your engagement in writing and storying? Got some examples? Yeah, please.
I crashed and burned comprehensively about 5 years ago with depression, anxiety, and in feeling like I was going to implode, just pulled an iPad out and a poem came out. So I was prolifically writing poems, which have since become now my new trajectory apart from teaching. But what was really, really interesting was that the early poems were very dark, very heavy, very rhythmic. And they needed to be that way because the chaos inside needed to be contained. And as time went on, the tone changed. They lightened up. It was like a filtering process. Now we're talking 2 or 3 years, and and it's not an everyday process. It became less and less, and it's just on an as needs basis. But I find it fascinating that there can be that sort of evolution, and that's part of the transformation. And from darkness to joy and to light is huge. From despair. I mean, I can say poetry saved my life because I know where I was, and I know how it helped me. So for me, there's, we talk about hope for the future. Creativity is the ultimate hope because you don't need to go to someone else to be creative. It's part of our intrinsic self. We wouldn't have survived as a human race if we weren't intrinsically resilient. We wouldn't be here. So we have come to believe we're dependent, and in a sense, our world and our system encourages dependence because it means, people have jobs and people have sense of purpose and all that sort of thing. But I do think that we need to create, especially for children who are the next generation coming through, to equip them with creative tools that aren't assessed, that aren't part of a curriculum, but the joy of creativity to let them find themselves and be, and they will find their path. They don't need, to be asked all the time who you're going to be. Just give them a paintbrush and a pen and a music and let them dance and let them run around, and they'll fix the world up. They don't need us to fix it for them,
So beautiful. I agree. I think it's good.
Thank you so much.
Can you just pass the mic back?
Going to ask a question about, from an educational point of view, is there a particular correct time? Everything is trying to manage the day-to-day of learning for the students. When is there a particular time of the day on any given day of the school week that is more creative for a student, because you need to be open to creativity. There's no point, I wouldn't follow on from a maths lesson straight into a writing session. Perhaps you could in that, but are there limitations, and has there been research on, is there a better time of day, or is it when you're more relaxed? Is that when inspiration flows?
Look, the evidence I have, and I'm not fully qualified to comment, but I'll give a rough guess based on what I've read in the past, is that sense of determining your own creativity is to the person.
Yeah.
As physical beings, we have rhythms throughout the day when some of us have more energy in the morning or more energy at night. Some of us are more reflective on the basis of that energy level. My question sort of goes around the other way, is how can we get the school system to match whatever pattern is to the person? Because it's the individual whose rhythms change rather than everyone fitting into some box. Yeah.
And as an adult, we write when it suits us and when it comes to us. But for students at school, they're on a timetable.
Yes.
So that's I'm curious about how do teachers structure that.
I don't know. Good question. Let's go do the research to find out what works best. I mean, I'm sure every school has time set aside for lessons, and you've just got to fit it in there.
Yeah. Thank you.
I know in my own experience, I've changed over 10 years. I used to do all of my writing at about 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it would just go fall out of me. Can't do that now. Now I write best in the morning. I hate mornings. It's physically painful. It's an awful time of the day for me. But now I seem to write better in the morning. So I don't know.
No.
And I'm sure there are some good psychologists out there doing great research on this stuff. Go look it up. We can Google Scholar it and we'll find it.
The books were probably written after school, which is interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
The lessons are after school or on holidays.
That's right,
A lot of these books are written in school holiday weeks where they've got an entire day.
One of the boys actually talks about, the little boy who has, he talks about how he has to go back and write the book. So he's actually talking about writing the book. So the one who likes to run, and then the classroom is like a dungeon. In the end, he's talking, I can actually go back and I can write the book. So it's an interesting how he's answering that question. Yeah, so.
Well, we've come to that time where we have to wrap it up. So I'll just sort of leave you with a few summary ideas. Remember the RIASEC I talked about? Realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising and conventional. We all grow up into some combinations of that. How we do it? Well, that's still the grand problem to be solved when it comes to getting kids to think about who they are and how they're going to overcome their challenges and feel really confident in the future. Whether it be for work or in other contexts, it doesn't matter. So the real challenge to us is how do we create situations which enable writing and storing for children to strengthen them for the future. There's lots of good stuff done. There's a lot more research to be done around this and how to do it really effectively. So on that note, I'll say thank you. It's been a great audience, and thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Peter.